May 1922. A 24-year-old woman named Molly Maja limps slowly into a dentist's waiting room. She is young, beautiful, full of life, but she is rotting from the inside out. Today, she is scheduled for yet another tooth extraction. It has become a grim routine. 6 months ago, it started with a simple toothache. But since then, Molly's mouth has begun to literally fall apart. Her dentist, Dr. Joseph Neff, has already pulled so many of her teeth that she has hardly any left. Instead of healing, the empty sockets have transformed into oozing, pus-filled ulcers. The smell of decay is overpowering, unlike anything the doctor has ever encountered. Molly struggles into the chair, wincing from the severe, inexplicable pain in her hips and feet. But that agony is nothing compared to the fire in her mouth. Today, her jaw hurts worse than ever. Dr. Neff, hoping to relieve her suffering, reaches into her mouth. He moves with extreme caution, trying to be gentle. He lightly touches her jawbone, and then it snaps. Under the slightest pressure, the bone crumbles like dry tissue paper. It is shattered, dead. Days later, the horror reaches its peak. Dr. Neff reaches into Molly's mouth and removes her entire lower jaw, simply by lifting it out. No surgery is needed. The bone has separated from the flesh. Molly is deteriorating at a terrifying speed. And unless Dr. Neff can solve this gruesome puzzle, he knows one thing for certain. This young woman will not survive. To understand Molly's fate, we must look at the world she lived in. It was the dawn of the Roaring Twenties. The Great War was over, and America was drunk on optimism, new music, and new science. And the brightest star in this new universe was a magical, glow-in-the-dark element called radium. Discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898, by the 1920s, radium had become a global sensation. It wasn't just an element, it was a miracle. It was hailed as a cure for cancer, a fountain of youth, and a modern marvel. It was everywhere. You could buy it over the counter in Radithor, a radioactive energy water sold as a cure for the living dead. It was in face creams to give you a glowing complexion. It was in chocolate. It was even in chicken feed, sold to farmers with the absurd promise that it would make hens lay self-incubating eggs. But beyond its supposed healing powers, radium was prized for its beauty. Nicknamed liquid sunshine, it emitted a mesmerizing, ethereal blue-green light. This unique property created a booming new industry, luminous paint. For the first time, wristwatches and military instruments could be read in total darkness. The products flew off the shelves. And to meet this massive demand, factories needed workers. To produce these thousands of glowing dials, factories needed delicate hands. They hired thousands of young women, and one of them was Molly Maja. Shortly after starting her job at the studio, the trouble began. First, the toothaches. Then, a strange, migrating pain spreading into her hips and knees. Her doctor, baffled by the disintegration of her jaw and her rapid decline, reached for the only diagnosis that seemed to fit the symptoms of bone decay: syphilis. It was a convenient answer, but it was wrong. Late-stage syphilis can attack the bones, but Molly had none of the other telltale signs. No rashes, no mental deterioration. She remained sharp and fully aware, even as her body crumbled. Desperate and humiliated by the stigma of a sexually transmitted disease she knew she didn't have, Molly sought a second opinion, then a third. But no one could see past the false diagnosis. No one could see the real poison. On September 12, 1922, after months of agonizing suffering, Molly Maggia died. She was only 24 years old. Her death certificate, a final insult to her memory, listed the cause of death as syphilis. Her family was confused and heartbroken, but they had no answers. The first Radium Girl was gone, and the killer remained invisible. Just 2 days after Molly's funeral in New Jersey, the cycle began again, 800 miles away. In the small, tight-knit town of Ottawa, Illinois, a newspaper ad heralded the arrival of a glittering new opportunity. The Radium Dial Company was opening a factory, and they needed young women with nimble fingers for the delicate art of dial painting. The ad promised a clean and healthful environment. And for the young women of Ottawa, it was a dream come true. The pay was fantastic, far better than typical factory work. And the studio itself was a beautiful, sunlit former high school. But the real draw was the radium itself. It was glamorous. It was expensive. Working with it felt like touching magic. Young women flocked to the studio like moths to a flame. Though the company officially only hired over 18s, many girls as young as 15 lied about their age to get in. On their first day, they met their superintendent, Lottie Murray. She was friendly, encouraging, a fun atmosphere. She taught them the basics of the job, never hinting at any danger. In that bright, cheerful room, surrounded by friends and the promise of a glowing future, the trap was set. Any lingering doubts about safety were quickly dispelled. One instructor, wanting to show just how harmless the paint was, casually scooped up a spatula full and ate it. Reassured, the girls began their work, mixing the magical powder into paints they gave whimsical names like Luna and Marvelite. But applying this glowing paste to tiny watch dials required extreme precision. The brush tips had to be needle-sharp. And so, the instructors taught them the technique that would seal their fate. It was called lip pointing. The instruction was simple: lip, dip, paint. To get the perfect point on their camel hair brushes, the girls were told to put the brush between their lips, twirling it with their tongues to a razor's edge. They did this 10, 12, 14 times for every single dial. With hundreds of dials painted each day, they were ingesting the radioactive paint thousands of times. They were literally eating poison, sip by tiny sip. This deadly technique wasn't unique to Ottawa. It had been imported directly from the United States Radium Corporation in New Jersey, the very same factory where Molly Maggia had worked before her jaw crumbled to dust. Back in New Jersey, Molly's former co-workers missed her laughter, but they had no idea of the agony she had endured. To them, the paint was still a toy. Before dates and dances, they would paint their nails, their faces, and even their teeth with the luminous substance turning themselves into glowing ghosts in the dark. But soon, the shadow fell on another girl, Irene Rudolph. When the pain started in her mouth, Irene didn't connect it to Molly. But the symptoms were terrifyingly identical. As her health collapsed, she was laid off, and her medical bills drained her family's savings. Her new doctors, unaware of Molly's case, were baffled. They searched for an answer and landed on an old, industrial disease from the Victorian era, phasejaw. In the 19th century, matchstick workers exposed to toxic phosphorus fumes suffered from rotting jawbones. The symptoms matched Irene's perfectly: the necrosis, the abscesses, the smell. But there was one problem. Irene didn't work with phosphorus. She worked with radium. And the doctors were looking for the wrong killer. The diagnosis of phasejaw triggered a brief panic. Chemists analyzed the paint formula, searching for phosphorus. But when they found none, the company breathed a sigh of relief. U.S. Radium's vice president, Harold Veit, even lied, claiming they had warned the girls against lip-pointing. Since there was no phosphorus, they argued, the company was in the clear. It wasn't their fault. Irene was left to rot. Her decline was horrific. Her jawbone died completely, becoming a black, necrotic mass inside her living face. Ulcers sprouted from her mouth down to her throat. Finally, in July of 1923, she passed away. She was 21. But Irene didn't die in a vacuum. She lived with her cousin, Catherine Schaub, who was also a dial painter. Catherine had watched every moment of Irene's agony. She had held her hand through the gruesome dentist appointments. And back at the factory, she began to hear whispers. Rumors about Molly Maja dying the exact same way. As she mourned her cousin, a terrifying pattern began to take shape in Catherine's mind. The dots were connecting. Despite her grief, despite the growing fear gnawing at her, Catherine Schaub had no choice. She needed the money. So, she returned to the studio. Day in and day out, she sat at her bench. She dipped her brush into the glowing paint. She painted the tiny dial. And then, without thinking, she put the brush back into her mouth. Dip, paint, lick. Hundreds of times a day. Thousands of times a week. She was swallowing the same poison that had killed her cousin. She was sharpening the weapon that would kill her. And then, one ordinary afternoon, Catherine felt it. A dull, throbbing ache in her tooth. The exact same way it had started for Molly. The exact same way it had started for Irene. The nightmare had come for her. Molly was the first. Irene was the second. Both succumbed to the same peculiar, undiagnosable rot. Their teeth died, replaced by oozing ulcers. Their jaws disintegrated. While Molly's death was just a dark rumor on the factory floor, Irene's death hit closer to home for Catherine Schaub. She had watched her cousin die. And now, as she felt the first twinges of pain in her own jaw, Catherine heard the terrifying news about a third girl. Helen Quinlan, another dial painter, had died just a month before Irene. Her doctors had given her yet another bizarre diagnosis: Vincent's angina, also known as trench mouth, a disease common among soldiers living in squalor. It is a horrific way to die. The infection causes the tissue in the throat to become so swollen and necrotic that it eventually dislodges, blocking the windpipe. The patient, essentially, chokes to death on their own rotting flesh. The diagnoses were a mess of contradictions. Helen had trench mouth and phossy jaw, a phosphorus poisoning, even though there was no phosphorus in the factory. Irene had phossy jaw. Molly had syphilis. The doctors were grasping at straws, blaming everything except the one thing all these dead girls had in common. But Catherine Schaub saw the pattern clearly. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't a coincidence. It was U.S. radium. The day after her cousin Irene's funeral, Catherine did something incredibly brave. She filed a formal report with the Department of Health. She didn't know exactly what the poison was, but she explicitly mentioned the lip-pointing technique. She pointed a finger directly at the brush in her mouth. The department's response was pathetic. They made a single, quick phone call to the factory. The company's vice president, Harold Viat, smoothly denied any wrongdoing. He assured them everything was safe. And just like that, the investigation was closed. The matter was settled. Catherine Schaub wasn't satisfied. She knew her friends were being murdered. And as 1923 came to a close, the horror stories piled up. One girl died of pneumonia and gangrene. Another developed a mysterious limp. Another went to the dentist on Christmas Eve and never returned to work. Suddenly, the company changed the rules. The girls were instructed to stop lip pointing. The official excuse? Their saliva might harm the adhesive in the paint. Catherine knew it was a bold-faced lie. The company knew something. They were scared. But they still refused to tell the girls why. Even though she stopped putting the brush in her mouth, Catherine continued to get worse. She sought help from Dr. Walter Berry, the same dentist who had watched her cousin Irene die. And this time, Dr. Berry wasn't alone. Two sisters, Josephine and Genevieve Smith, also came to him with rotting jaws. Dr. Barry realized this was an epidemic. He did something extraordinary. He brought his patients together. Catherine, the Smith sisters, and another painter named Marguerite Carloch sat down in his office. For the first time, they weren't suffering in silence. They were a group, and they were beginning to share their secrets. Dr. Barry couldn't cure them, but he made a promise. He would stop pulling their teeth. He saw that every extraction only created a new, unhealing wound. He also gave them a stark warning. Quit. Leave the factory. Tell everyone to leave. But many girls, needing the money, stayed, and the sickness spread. Hazel Vincent, another dial painter, sought help in New York City. She became the first of the girls to undergo a cutting-edge new procedure, an X-ray. The technology was still new, poorly understood by many, but what it revealed inside Hazel's face was unmistakable. Her jawbone wasn't just rotting, it was dotted with thousands of minuscule holes. Her famed oral surgeon, Dr. Theodore Blum, looked at the image and said the bone looked moth-eaten. The condition finally had a clinical name, osteomyelitis of the mandible, a massive infection of the jawbone. It was so rare, so severe, and so specific that Dr. Blum felt compelled to present this strange case to his colleagues. In his speech to the American Society of Oral Surgeons, Dr. Blum charted the terrifying progression of Hazel's disease. It started in the gums, swelling until her tongue became immobile. It looked like gingivitis, but the rot was deep in the bone. Pulling teeth was useless. It only opened the door for the necrotic infection to spread to her lymph nodes. He ruled out Fossyjaw. Hazel hadn't touched phosphorus. So what was it? The answer was hidden at the very end of his speech, in a small, unassuming footnote that would change history. He wrote about a case similar to phosphorus necrosis, but caused by something else entirely. Caused, he wrote, by some radioactive substance used in the manufacture of luminous dials. For the first time, a doctor had dared to say it. He gave this new, horrifying condition a name. He called it radium jaw. The term radium jaw had whispered around oncology wards before, used to describe cancer patients who developed toothaches and bone pain after radiation therapy. But no one had ever connected it to the healthy young women painting watches. Until now. Dr. Blum realized that radium's power to kill cancer cells came with a terrible price. It killed healthy cells too, just slower. He was the first to point the finger at America's favorite element. And in 1923, this was heresy. Radium was the miracle cure of the age. It was in anti-aging creams. It was in heating pads for rheumatism. Doctors prescribed it for impotence. The idea that this glowing, life-giving substance could be a killer was unthinkable. But the executives at U.S. Radium knew the truth. And they were about to launch a cover-up so extensive, so ruthless, that they would knowingly condemn their own employees to death rather than admit their product was poison. By early 1924, the factory was in chaos. Girls were fleeing in droves. And then the mother of Hazel Vincent hand-delivered a letter demanding compensation for her dying daughter. U.S. Radium was in crisis mode. Desperate to avoid a lawsuit and salvage their reputation, the company president, Arthur Roeder, made a calculated move. He hired a prestigious Harvard professor, Dr. Cecil Drinker, to conduct an independent investigation. Roeder likely hoped that a clean bill of health from Harvard would silence the rumors forever. Dr. Drinker brought along his wife and colleague, Dr. Catherine Drinker. They were scientists, not corporate pawns. They agreed to inspect the factory in April. In the meantime, the company conducted its own sham internal investigation. They found more sick girls, of course, but they concluded, conveniently, that the corporation was innocent of any wrongdoing. They were ready to gaslight the world, but they hadn't counted on the integrity of the Drinkers. Before the Harvard team arrived, company vice president Harold Veidt agreed to meet with the troublesome local dentist, Dr. Barry. He expected to easily dismiss the man's concerns. He was wrong. Dr. Barry, along with his colleague Dr. Davidson, had spent months watching young women die in agony. They were furious. Barry looked Veidt in the eye and told him to shutter the factory immediately. It was the only way to stop the senseless deaths. Veidt refused, Closing the plant was unimaginable. Profits came first. Instead, the factory kept running, and the girls kept dying. On April 15th, just one day before the drinkers were scheduled to arrive, 20-year-old Jenny Stocker died. Her cause of death was osteomyelitis, but this time it was in her knee, not her jaw. The executives dismissed it as unrelated, but the girls on the factory floor knew better. They knew the poison was moving. It was in their jaws, their hips, their knees. It was everywhere. On April 16, 1924, the Harvard team stepped onto the factory floor, and immediately they were horrified. The air was thick with glowing dust. It settled on the workers' hair, their clothes, their skin. There was zero safety equipment. The girls were inhaling radium with every breath. But the true horror was yet to come. The company had made a fatal mistake. They had invited a former employee back to be interviewed, Marguerite Karloff. Marguerite was a walking corpse, gaunt, pale, her face wrapped in bandages to hide the leaking ulcers that had destroyed her mouth. Beside her stood her sister, Sarah, still working at the factory, but already leaning heavily on a cane, her own body beginning to fail. The sight of these two sisters, one dying and one following in her footsteps, shook Dr. Catherine Drinker to her core. She turned to the company president and demanded a full medical examination of the current workforce. Cornered, with his own independent experts staring him down, Roeder had no choice but to agree. The examinations took place in the women's restroom. 22 workers were inspected. Because Dr. Catherine Drinker was a woman, she was able to gain the girls' trust, convincing them to disrobe for a thorough check. And then she did something simple. She turned off the lights. In the darkness, the room was suddenly bathed in an eerie, pale green light. It was coming from the girls themselves. Their necks, their chests, their inner thighs, their faces, they were all luminous. The radium dust wasn't just on them, it was in them. It was seeping out of their pores. The girls had once thought this glow was magical, painting themselves for parties, but now, in the silence of that dark restroom, the liquid sunshine looked like what it truly was, a death mark. The drinkers took blood samples. When the results came back negative for phosphorus, the company rejoiced, spinning the news to claim the factory was safe, but they were lying by omission. They focused on the phosphorus to distract from the radium. The company tried to silence the scientists, threatening a lawsuit if their full report was ever published. But the drinkers were outraged. They refused to be intimidated. They dug deeper, calculating that the girls were ingesting about 100 milligrams of radioactive paint every single day. Finally, they published their findings. The report was a bombshell. It concretely, scientifically linked the jaw necrosis and the Vincent's angina directly to radium poisoning. For the dial painters, it was vindication. For years they had been gaslit, told their sickness was their own fault, told that radium was safe. Now they had proof in black and white. But proof doesn't pay medical bills. U.S. Radium denied the results and refused to help their dying employees. So, on February 5, 1925, Marguerite Karloff fighting for her life, filed the first lawsuit. The battle had begun. Marguerite knew she was dying. She had no money, no strength left, but she had the truth. Her bravery sparked a fire. Grace Fryer, Catherine Schaub, Edna Hussman, and 2 of Molly Madge's sisters joined her. The press dubbed them the Radium Girls. They knew their own lives were forfeit. They weren't fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for the girls in Ottawa, Illinois, and in factories across the country who were still lip-pointing, kept in the dark by bosses who valued profit over life. But the Radium Girls faced an uphill battle. They had to fight a powerful corporation in court, and they had to fight public opinion in the press. To most Americans, radium was still a magical cure-all. Now, a group of dying, working-class girls had to prove to the world that its favorite miracle was actually a monster. While the Radium Girls prepared for the fight of their lives, a silent, terrifying piece of evidence lay hidden in a dentist's drawer, waiting to reveal the true horror of their condition. Dr. Joseph Kneff could never forget Molly Maggia. Her disintegrated jawbone haunted him. He had kept the fragments, intending to study them, but amidst the flood of sick dial painters, he had shoved them into a desk drawer and forgotten them. A year later, searching for an X-ray film, he opened that drawer and made a chilling discovery. The film was ruined, fogged, exposed to some mysterious energy source. Neff dug through the clutter, files, pens, paperclips, until he reached the bottom. There, he found the dried fragments of Molly's jaw. He realized, with a jolt of horror, what had happened. Molly had ingested so much radium that, even now, a year after her death, her bones were still radioactive. They were emitting a signal strong enough to expose film through paper and darkness. Her skeleton was literally glowing with lethal energy. And if her dead bones were doing this, what was the radium doing to the living girls still working at the factory? It was easy for the executives to ignore the deaths of young, working-class women, but the poison didn't discriminate. Dr. Edwin Lehman was the company's chief chemist. He had shrugged off the lesions on his hands for months, but then he suddenly collapsed and died. Because he was a man and a professional, the company finally paid attention. His symptoms were different. His jaw didn't rot. Instead, he died from a ferociously swift case of anemia. His red blood cells had simply vanished. In the 1920s, anemia was rarely fatal and usually treatable. But Lehman's condition killed him in weeks. It was a medical impossibility. Radium was marketed as a cure for anemia, a substance that boosted red blood cells. How could the chief scientist of a radium company die from a lack of them? The contradiction was baffling and terrifying. The rumors reached Dr. Harrison Martland, the chief medical examiner of Newark. Martland was a meticulous man, and when he heard about Dr. Lehman's death, he immediately suspected radium poisoning. But the standard tests found nothing. Martland knew the tests were wrong. To prove it, he needed help. He needed someone who understood radium better than anyone else. He turned to Sabin von Suchocki. An Austrian scientist, von Suchocki was the co-founder of U.S. Radium, and the very man who had invented the luminous paint formula. He had once disregarded safety, even though his own fingers were scarred and burned by the element he loved. But now, having been pushed out of his own company and seeing the horror he had unleashed, he was ready to help Martland find the truth. Together, they prepared to descend into the belly of the beast. Inside the factory, Martland and von Sachaki used a specialized instrument called an electrometer to test Dr. Lehman's bones. The needle jumped. His skeleton was radioactive. And in that moment, they understood the terrifying mechanism of the poison. It was a case of biological mistaken identity. Chemically, radium is incredibly similar to calcium. When the girls ingested the paint, their bodies didn't see it as a poison. They saw it as a nutrient. The body absorbed the radium and deposited it directly into the bones, believing it was strengthening them. But instead of building bone, the radium began to bombard it from the inside with constant, destructive radiation. The immune system never attacked it because it thought it belonged there. The element was locked away, deep in the skeleton, slowly rotting the women from the inside out. And once it was in the bone, there was absolutely no way to get it out. Martland and von Sachaki knew they couldn't save the girls. It was too late. But they could give them the truth. To bypass their non-disclosure agreement with the company, they needed to find the radium in a living patient. They turned to Sarah Mailfire. Sarah was now bedridden, sharing a hospital room with her dying sister, Marguerite. Every breath was a struggle, but she agreed to help. The scientists invented a groundbreaking new test. They knew that as radium decays, it releases a gas called radon. So they built a device to measure it. In June 1925, from her deathbed, Sarah breathed into the machine. She became the first dial painter in history to be tested for radium poisoning. And as the dials on the machine spiked, the invisible killer was finally made visible. Sarah wasn't just sick, she was a living, breathing, radioactive source. The breath test was just the prelude. The final, undeniable proof would have to come from the dead. On June 18, 1925, just 2 days after breathing into the machine, Sarah Malifer passed away. She was 35 years old, her body ravaged by the invisible fire she had swallowed for years. Dr. Martland wasted no time. He performed the autopsy immediately, driven by a need to expose the truth that had been buried for so long. In the cold silence of the morgue, he devised a brilliant, macabre experiment. He knew that X-rays, a form of radiation, could leave an image on photographic film. So he took the bones he had removed from Sarah's body. He cleaned them. And then, in total darkness, he laid them onto sheets of unexposed X-ray film. He waited. When he developed the film, the result was breathtaking and horrifying. The sheets were not black. They were marked with white, ghostly shapes, the perfect silhouettes of Sarah's bones. Her skeleton was so saturated with radium that it was taking its own X-rays. Martland had proved it beyond a shadow of a doubt. The poison was everywhere. Facing the press, Martland tried to maintain the cool detachment of a scientist. He was diplomatic, careful. He told reporters He wasn't yet ready to officially use the term commercial radium poisoning. But the damage was done. By uttering the phrase, he had given the nightmare a name. The secret was out. The miracle element was a serial killer. And the U.S. Radium Corporation was guilty. U.S. Radium fought back with a weapon more dangerous than lawyers: misinformation. Vice President Harold Viet addressed the press, calling the idea that his factory was killing people absurd. To prove it, he announced they had hired an independent expert of the greatest reliability and reputation. His name was Dr. Frederick Flynn. Flynn arrived at the factory with the air of a distinguished medical professional. He met with dozens of terrified dial painters. He sat with them, took their blood, listened to their hearts, and then, with a reassuring smile, he delivered the good news. He told them they were perfectly healthy. He told them there was absolutely nothing to worry about. He said this to women who were losing their teeth. He said this to women who could barely walk. He looked into the eyes of dying girls and lied. Because Frederick Flynn was a fraud. Yes, he was a doctor. He held a Ph.D. in industrial hygiene. But he was not a physician. He had no medical license. He had no right to examine patients, let alone diagnose them. He was a corporate fixer, a man on the company payroll, paid to perform a role. And his role was to gaslight these women into their graves. In December 1926, Flynn published his report. It was a masterpiece of deception. He claimed that radium jaw didn't exist. He argued the girls were suffering from a simple bacterial infection. And most audaciously, he stated that despite his extensive testing, he had found zero evidence of radioactivity in any of the dial painters. His conclusion was definitive: an industrial hazard does not exist. He tried his charm on Grace Fryer. After examining her, he smiled and told her she seemed to be in better health than he was. It was a line he had used to pacify countless terrified women. But Grace Fryer wasn't having it. She felt the pain in her bones. She saw her friends dying. She knew with absolute certainty that he was lying. Instead of being pacified, she was enraged. She decided then and there that she would not go quietly. She would drag U.S. Radium into the light. She planned to sue, demanding justice for herself and the friends she had already lost. She told the corporation she wouldn't settle for a penny less than $5,000. The fight was on. U.S. Radium laughed off her demand, and Grace found herself trapped in a new nightmare. Her life became a blur of pain, unpaid medical bills, and endless rejections. The situation seemed hopeless because the clock was ticking. The statute of limitations for a personal injury lawsuit was 2 years. Molly Maggia had died years ago. Most of the sick girls had left the factory long before that. Legally, their time had already run out. Lawyer after lawyer turned Grace away. Some were deterred by the timeline. Others were simply terrified of taking on a titan like the U.S. Radium Corporation. What good was truth against that kind of money and power? But finally, she found a champion, a young, ambitious Harvard law graduate named Raymond Berry. He wasn't afraid. In March 1927, Barry agreed to take the case. He ordered yet another round of grueling medical exams for the girls, but this time the results were not suppressed. He found exactly what he expected: undeniable evidence of severe radiation poisoning. Barry argued that the statute of limitations shouldn't apply because the company had fraudulently concealed the danger. The judge agreed. The case was allowed to proceed. The Radium Girls were going to trial. The trial became a media sensation. Headlines screamed the tragedy of the walking ghosts, describing Grace Fryer appearing in court held up by a steel back brace because her spine could no longer support her own weight. U.S. Radium, terrified of the bad press, tried to settle, but Grace refused. She wanted her day in court. But her case faced a shocking threat from within. Dr. Joseph Neff, the dentist who had treated Molly Maggia, the man who had first discovered the radioactive jawbone, betrayed them. Over the years, he had treated dozens of dial painters, often for reduced fees, out of pity. But now, broke and embittered, he saw an opportunity. He approached U.S. Radium with a chilling offer. He claimed that as their doctor, he had influence over the girls. For a fee of $10,000, he promised to manipulate them into dropping the lawsuit. Or he could testify for the company, lying on the stand, to say the girls were suffering from gum disease or syphilis, anything but radium. It was pure extortion. If they refused, he threatened to sue the dying girls for their unpaid medical bills, adding even more misery to their lives. Even U.S. Radium was disgusted by Kneff's immorality. They rejected his offer, and the dentist slunk away into obscurity. But the girls still had a star witness: Dr. Sabine von Sochacki, the inventor of the paint itself. He was dying from radium poisoning, his own fingers black and necrotic. Surely he would tell the truth. In April 1928, the hearing began. The girls testified first, their broken bodies serving as undeniable evidence. Grace Fryer recounted how von Sochacki himself had once warned her against lip-pointing. Then von Sochacki took the stand. And he broke their hearts. He admitted he had warned Grace, but he lied about the reason. He claimed he had told her to stop not because the paint was radioactive poison, but because lip-pointing was unsanitary. He argued that germs on the brush could cause an infection. He looked at the dying women he had helped doom and asserted that radium was not to blame. To this day, no one knows why he changed his story. Perhaps he wanted to protect his legacy. Perhaps he was threatened. But months later, the very element he defended would kill him. Von Sochacki's betrayal was a heavy blow. But Raymond Barry had one last weapon: Dr. Harrison Martland. On the stand, the medical examiner was commanding and unequivocal. He presented his findings: the radioactive bones, the film tests, the undeniable link between the glowing paint and the girls' decaying bodies. His testimony was devastating. The evidence was piling up, supported by scientists around the world, including Marie Curie herself, who was slowly dying from her own discovery. U.S. Radium was cornered, so they used the only weapon they had left: time. When it was their turn to present a defense, They claimed their expert witness had a prior engagement and couldn't attend. They requested a delay, and the judge, incredibly, granted it. The next hearing was set for September, 5 months later. For the Radium Girls, 5 months was a lifetime. Dr. Martland had estimated they had less than a year to live. The company wasn't trying to win the case. They were simply waiting for the plaintiffs to die. The delay was a death sentence, but federal judge William Clark intervened. Recognizing the girls didn't have years to wait, he pushed for a settlement. Raymond Barry hesitated. He wanted a total victory. But he looked at his clients, frail, broken, in constant agony, and knew they couldn't endure a prolonged trial. He agreed to negotiate. The first offer from U.S. Radium was insultingly low, $10,000. Barry countered. He demanded $15,000 up front, full coverage of all past and future medical bills, and a $600 annual pension for as long as they lived. In June 1928, a deal was struck. The company agreed to pay $10,000 up front, a fortune in those days, and cover the medical costs and pension. But they added a cruel condition. The women had to submit to further medical examinations by a panel of experts. The company's intention was transparent. They weren't admitting guilt. They were still hoping that, somehow, they could find evidence to prove radium wasn't to blame. The girls accepted the settlement. They had no choice. Grace Fryer was relieved to have secured something for her family, but the victory was bittersweet. U.S. Radium never admitted liability. Legally, they were not guilty of poisoning anyone, which meant the radium industry itself was off the hook. And so, the horror repeated itself. In Ottawa, Illinois, at the Radium Dial Company, the pattern began again. Girls fell ill. Jaws rotted. And again, 5 brave women had to sue their employer. But this time, the tide had turned. They won their case, and they shut the factory down for good. Public opinion was finally shifting. The miracle element was revealing its true face. In 1931, a wealthy socialite who drank Radithor energy water every day lost his entire jaw and died of acute radiation syndrome. The headline read, "The radium water worked fine until his jaw came off." Suddenly, the radium craze was over. The products were pulled from shelves. The miracle was dead. The dial painters lived just long enough to see the world finally believe them. But their suffering was far from over. Catherine Schaub survived for 5 more years after the settlement. But the radium inside her never stopped working. A massive tumor grew on her leg, swelling to the size of a bowling pin. She begged for amputation, but doctors told her it was pointless. The poison was in her blood. She died in February 1933. Grace Fryer followed her soon after. But their deaths were not in vain. Their death certificates finally told the truth. Industrial poisoning. And, in a final act of justice, Molly Maggia's body was exhumed, and her certificate was corrected. The word syphilis was struck out. In 1940, the U.S. Navy hired scientists to determine exactly how toxic radium truly was. They established that the maximum safe body burden for a human being was 0.1 micrograms. The Radium Girls, they discovered, had been walking around with up to 23 micrograms in their bodies. They had been carrying more than 200 times the lethal dose in their own bones. But even the deaths of the Radium Girls couldn't kill the industry completely. World War II and the dawn of the atomic age brought a renewed demand for radioactive instruments. U.S. Radium, which had nearly gone bankrupt, surged back to life, employing thousands. The poison lingered. In 1957, the EPA investigated the old factory site in New Jersey. The soil, the air, the very ground the town was built on was radioactive. It wasn't until 2006, nearly a century after Molly Maggia first dipped her brush, that the cleanup was finally completed. Over 135,000 tons of radioactive soil had to be dug up and removed from the residential neighborhood where the factory once stood. We will never know how many other people suffered from this silent legacy of negligence. But thanks to the sacrifice of the Radium Girls and the tireless work of scientists like Dr. Martland and Marie Curie, we finally learned to respect the invisible fire. Today, we understand the mechanics of the killer. Radium emits 3 types of radiation. Gamma rays are powerful enough to pass straight through the body. Beta particles can penetrate the skin and cause burns. But the primary culprit in the girl's suffering was the alpha particle. Alpha particles carry a massive amount of energy, but they are easily blocked by a simple sheet of paper or a layer of skin. If the girls had only touched the radium, they might have been fine. But because of the lip pointing, because they swallowed it, the radium bypassed their skin entirely. It settled in their bones, mere microns away from their living cells. From that vantage point, the alpha particles acted like microscopic cannons, firing point-blank into their tissue, 24 hours a day, destroying their DNA, mutating their cells, and crumbling their bones. Nobody wanted to believe that the most valuable substance on Earth was a poison. It took the agonizing public deaths of dozens of young women to force the world to open its eyes.